John Tice was not a television personality. He was not a performer who had spent years building toward a camera opportunity. He was not a character assembled by a production company from a focus group's understanding of what an Appalachian monster hunter should look and sound like. He was a man from the mountains of West Virginia who had spent his entire life in the specific world that mountain monsters documented, who knew those woods and those communities and those stories the way that a person knows things they have lived rather than things they have studied, and whose presence on that show was the reason the audience believed what they were watching was real. John Tice, known to everyone who watched Mountain Monsters as Trapper, was the soul of that show from its first episode to its last. And what happened to him in the years after Mountain Monsters ended is a story that nobody talked about in the way it deserved to be talked about, that his audience deserved to know, and that the show he built from the ground up in the mountains he spent his entire life in was never designed to prepare anyone to hear. Stay until the end. This is the complete story. Mountain Monsters premiered on Destination America on June 22, 2013. The premise was not complicated. A team of Appalachian hunters and trappers, led by Trapper, investigating reports of cryptid creatures in the mountains of West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and the surrounding region. The format was simple. The locations were real. The men were real, and the specific quality of what the show produced, the humor, the camaraderie, the genuine affection between the team members, and the specific character of people who had spent their lives in those mountains doing things that the rest of the country had no framework for, was something that no production meeting had manufactured and that no casting process could have replicated with different people. Mountain Monsters was not Ghost Adventures. It was not a show built on the methodology of scientific investigation or the technical rigor of equipment-based evidence collection. It was something different from that, and something that required a different kind of authenticity to produce. It required people who were genuinely from the world the show was documenting, people whose relationship to the mountains, to the folklore, to the community knowledge of what had been seen and heard in those forests across generations was personal rather than professional. Trapper was that relationship personified. He was not representing a community or a tradition. He was an expression of it, a man whose entire life had been lived in the specific context that Mountain Monsters was attempting to document, whose knowledge of those mountains was the kind that does not come from research or study, but from decades of direct engagement with the land and the people and the stories that the land produced. That authenticity was what the show was built on, and it was what made what happened to him after the show ended land the way it landed for the people who had spent seasons watching him in those woods. Subscribe right now before we go any further. This is the story you have been waiting for. John Tice was born in the mountain communities of West Virginia that Mountain Monsters documented, and he grew up in the specific world of Appalachian rural life, whose character the rest of the country encounters primarily through its cultural stereotypes rather than its actual texture. The mountains of West Virginia are not the mountains of a television set. They are working country whose people have maintained a relationship to the land that predates the industrial economy that transformed the rest of America, and whose traditions, including the specific tradition of cryptid folklore that Mountain Monsters was built around, are not entertainment. They are accumulated community knowledge of a landscape that has been producing unexplained accounts for as long as the communities living in it have been keeping records. Trapper grew up in that world. He learned to hunt and trap in the mountains the way that people learn things that are passed from generation to generation rather than taught in formal contexts. He developed the specific knowledge of animal behavior, of terrain, of the patterns that wild places produce, and the anomalies that those patterns occasionally throw up, that decades of direct engagement with the land produces in a person. He was not a naturalist in the academic sense. He was something more practically grounded than that, a man whose understanding of the mountains came from spending his life in them, and whose relationship to the unexplained stories those mountains produced was the relationship of a person who takes them seriously because the community that generated them takes them seriously, not because they fit a framework he had constructed from outside. By the time Mountain Monsters put cameras on him, Trapper had been doing what the show documented for decades without any camera present: the hunting, the trapping, the investigation of unexplained tracks and sounds and sightings that the mountain communities reported to people who knew how to take a report and know what to do with it. He had a reputation in those communities that preceded the show and that the show documented rather than created. The men who joined him on Mountain Monsters were not assembled for television. They were people from his world, people who knew him and whom he knew, whose participation in the show reflected existing relationships rather than casting decisions. That origin is visible in every episode of Mountain Monsters, and it is what made the show feel different from every comparable production that tried to replicate its formula after it found an audience. The Mountain Monsters team that the audience came to know across the show's run was not a team in the television sense of the word. It was a community. Buck, Wild Bill, Huckleberry, Willie, Jeff, and the others who appeared across the show's seasons were not co-workers assembled by a production company. They were people from Trapper's world whose relationships to him and to each other predated the show and whose presence on it reflected the specific social fabric of the Appalachian mountain communities that Mountain Monsters was documenting. That specific quality, the genuine familiarity between the team members, the humor that comes from people who have known each other for years rather than people performing familiarity for cameras, was what the audience responded to most strongly and what made Mountain Monsters something that comparable productions that tried to replicate its formula could never quite achieve. Trapper was the center of that community in the way that certain people are the center of the communities they belong to, not by formal authority or by deliberate cultivation of influence, but by the specific quality of their character and their history in a place. The team followed him not because the production required it, but because that was the existing dynamic before any production existed. His word carried weight in those mountains, in ways that the cameras could document but not create. When he said something was worth investigating, the team investigated it. When he said it was time to go, they went. That dynamic was real, and it produced something on screen that the show's audience recognized as genuine, even when the specific events of any given episode were contested or exaggerated. The core relationship between Trapper and his team was not a production artifact. It was a real thing that the cameras happened to be present for. Mountain Monsters documented something real about the world Trapper came from. What it could not document was the person behind the character the show built around him, the Trapper that the audience knew, the wry humor, the mountain wisdom delivered in one-liners whose specific character came from decades of living rather than writing, the physical presence of a man who looked like he had been shaped by the same forces that shaped the mountains he inhabited, was real. It was not a performance, but it was also not the complete picture of the man. The complete picture included things that the production format, built as it was around the investigation and the team dynamic and the creature of the week, had no structural mechanism for capturing. Trapper's health across the production years of Mountain Monsters was something that the people who worked alongside him and who knew him outside the production context were aware of in ways that the audience watching the show was not. He was not a young man when Mountain Monsters began. The physical demands of what the show required, the terrain, the hours, the conditions of filming in locations that were genuinely remote and genuinely difficult, were demands made on a person whose body had been shaped by decades of that kind of work, and that carried the accumulated history of those decades in ways that production cameras and production makeup could partially but not entirely manage. The people who worked closest to him across the seasons of Mountain Monsters have described a person who brought everything the show required and more, and who managed the cost of bringing it with a stoicism that was entirely consistent with where he came from, and entirely invisible to the audience watching the result. His personal life in the years of the show's production carried its own weight, as the personal lives of people whose professional context makes enormous demands on their time and their physical and psychological resources always do. The mountains of West Virginia are not a commuter culture. The people from those communities who build lives there build them in a specific context that the demands of a television production schedule disrupt in ways that are visible to the people living them without being visible to the cameras documenting the work. Trapper was a man from a specific place with a specific life in that place, and the years of Mountain Monsters were years lived at the intersection of that life and the production that was documenting it. What the intersection cost him was not something the show was designed to record. Mountain Monsters ran for 7 seasons between 2013 and 2022. Across those seasons, the show changed in ways that reflected both the natural evolution of a production that had found its audience and the specific challenges that any long-running reality format faces in maintaining the authenticity that made it work in its earlier seasons. The team that the audience had built its relationship to across the show's run changed. Cast members came and went. The format adapted. And Trapper, who had been the constant at the center of everything the show was built on, navigated those changes with the same stoicism and the same grounded presence that had made him the show's foundation from the beginning. What the audience could feel across the later seasons without being able to fully articulate what they were feeling was a change in the specific quality of Trapper's presence on screen. Not in his character or his humor or his engagement with the team and the investigations, in something more physical than any of those things. The mountains of West Virginia had been his domain for a lifetime. The terrain that the show documented was terrain he had been moving through for decades before any camera followed him into it. And across the later seasons of Mountain Monsters, the specific quality of how he moved through that terrain carried information that the people who had been watching him closely enough and for long enough could read even if they could not have named what they were reading. His health was a presence in those later seasons in the way that things are a presence when they are being managed rather than acknowledged, visible to the people who knew what to look for, and invisible to the format that had no mechanism for addressing it. The men who worked alongside Trapper on Mountain Monsters across its 7 seasons knew things about his health and his personal situation that the show's audience did not know, and that the production format was not designed to surface. The specific quality of the relationships between the Mountain Monsters team, the genuine familiarity of people from the same world whose connections to each other preceded the show, meant that the things that were known within the team were known completely rather than managed through the partial disclosure that professional relationships typically produce. They saw what the cameras did not position themselves to capture. They were present for the moments between the moments that the show documented, and across the later seasons of Mountain Monsters, what they were seeing in Trapper was something that the humor and the stoicism and the specific mountain character that had made him the show's foundation could not entirely conceal from people who knew him well enough to see past all of it. Buck, whose own story after Mountain Monsters carries its own heartbreaking dimension that his audience deserves to hear, was among the people closest to Trapper throughout the production years. The relationship between them was not a television relationship. It was the relationship of men from the same world who had known each other long enough that the cameras documenting their interactions were recording something real rather than producing something for the camera's benefit. What Buck has said about Trapper in the years since Mountain Monsters ended reflects a person navigating the specific difficulty of speaking publicly about someone whose story deserves to be told honestly and whose privacy deserves to be respected at the same time. That difficulty is visible in every public statement he has made about Trapper, and it is the most honest indicator available of how seriously the people who knew him take what his story actually contains. John Tice's health in the years following Mountain Monsters is the chapter of his story that the show's audience followed from the outside with the specific quality of concern that builds in people who have spent years watching someone they have come to care about across seasons of television. The reports that reached his audience through the channels that reality television casts maintain with their audiences, social media, convention appearances, the informal communications that the parasocial relationships television builds produce, told a story that the audience received with the specific helplessness of people who care about someone they have no direct way to help. He faced serious health challenges in the years after the show's production concluded. The specific character of those challenges and their relationship to the physical demands that decades of mountain life and years of Mountain Monsters production had made on his body is a story that the public record addresses partially, and that the people who were close to him during those years address with the care that genuine affection for a person produces when that person's story is a difficult one. What is visible in that public record is a man who faced what he faced with the same stoicism and the same grounded presence that had characterized his entire public history, not performing strength, expressing it in the specific way that people from places and traditions where difficulty is faced directly rather than managed through the frameworks that other contexts provide, express it. The audience that had spent 7 seasons watching Trapper in those mountains followed his health situation with an investment that the ordinary parasocial relationship of television viewing does not usually generate at that level of personal concern. These were people who felt correctly that what they had watched across 7 seasons was something more real than the standard reality television product. The genuine character of the show's central figure and the genuine quality of the relationships the show documented had built something in the audience that made his health their concern in a way that felt personal rather than professional. That investment is itself a measure of what Trapper built across those 7 seasons, and what his health journey in the years after the show represented to the people who had built that investment is the most heartbreaking dimension of the entire story. There is a specific irony in the story of what happened to Trapper after Mountain Monsters that the show's audience deserves to sit with. The mountains of West Virginia that defined his entire life were the thing that made him the person the show was built around. The decades of engagement with that terrain, with those communities, with the specific world that Mountain Monsters documented, produced the character and the knowledge and the presence that the audience fell in love with across 7 seasons of television. The mountains gave him every everything that made him who he was. And the physical cost of a lifetime in those mountains was also everything that made the years after the show as difficult as they were. Not a contradiction. The same thing. The mountains shaped the man, and the man was shaped by the cost of what the mountains required of the people who chose to live fully in them. That specific quality of a person whose greatest strengths and whose greatest vulnerabilities are produced by the same source is the most honest available description of what made Trapper both the ideal center of mountain monsters and the person for whom the years after it carried the specific weight they carried. He was not a person who could have been something different and avoided the cost. He was entirely the person the mountains made him. And the mountains do not make people who are easy to harm or easy to diminish. They make people who are hard to stop and harder to keep down, and whose response to difficulty is the specific response of people who have been navigating difficult terrain their entire lives. That response is what the audience who followed his health situation witnessed in the years after Mountain Monsters, and it is the most characteristically Trapper thing about the entire heartbreaking story. John Tice built something with Mountain Monsters that the reality television genre had not previously produced in quite the same way. Not a franchise, not a format that could be replicated with different people in different mountains. Something specific to him and to the world he came from, and to the team of people whose genuine connections to each other and to that world made the show what it was. 7 seasons of television whose humor was real, and whose affection was real, and whose relationship to the Appalachian mountain communities it documented was real in ways that the genre almost never manages to produce when it engages with those communities. That is what Trapper built, and it exists entirely independently of what the years after the show produced for him personally. The audience that built itself around Mountain Monsters across 7 seasons built it around something genuine, around a man whose character was not manufactured for cameras, and whose knowledge of the mountains was not performed for an audience, around a team whose relationships were not assembled by a casting director, and around a show whose specific quality came from the world it was documenting rather than from the production framework that was documenting it. That quality is Trapper's legacy. It is what the mountains of West Virginia produced in a man who spent his entire life in them and then spent 7 seasons letting cameras follow him through them. It is what nobody talked about in the way it deserved to be talked about when the show ended and when the years after it became what they became. And it is the part of the story of what happened to Trapper after Mountain Monsters that the heartbreaking dimension cannot erase, and that his audience, who followed those 7 seasons with the genuine investment that genuine television produces in people, deserves to have named directly. He gave the mountains of West Virginia a national audience. He gave Mountain Monsters a soul that the show could not have had without him, and what that giving cost him, and what it produced, is the most human story that reality television ever failed to tell properly. Subscribe now for more stories like this one. There is a specific quality to the Mountain Monsters audience that distinguishes it from the audiences that most reality television produces, and that makes the story of what happened to Trapper matter beyond the specific facts of one man's post-show years. These were not casual viewers. The people who built their relationship to Mountain Monsters across 7 seasons were people who found in it something that the broader reality television landscape was not providing. A show that treated the communities it documented with genuine respect rather than as the subject of an outside gaze. A show whose central figure was a person of genuine character rather than a produced personality. A show whose humor came from real people and real relationships rather than from the calculated conflict that reality television typically deploys to generate engagement. That specific quality of genuine respect for its subject built an audience whose investment in the people on screen went significantly deeper than the format typically produces. When Trapper's health situation became visible to that audience in the years after the show, the response it generated reflected exactly the depth of that investment. The concern was real. The engagement with whatever information was available was sustained and genuine. And the difficulty of watching someone who had given them something real navigate something genuinely hard was experienced by that audience as the specific difficulty of caring about someone rather than the ordinary passive concern that celebrity health news generates in a casual viewership. Trapper built that with them, not deliberately, not as a strategy, as the natural consequence of being genuinely present across 7 seasons of television in a way that the audience could feel was real. The relationship that presence built is the most enduring thing that Mountain Monsters produced. It outlasted the show. It outlasted the production schedule. It is present in the conversations the audience has about him now. And it is the most honest measure of what John Tice, the man from the mountains of West Virginia who was not a television personality and who became one anyway by simply being himself in front of cameras, left behind. That is what nobody talked about. And that is what deserved to be talked about most.